You are all very welcome this evening. We're very excited to have our second webinar for the Gigi Academy. So the second one today is the menstrual cycle. And so this is like our bread and butter, and we're so excited to go through it all. And we're very happy to take any questions at the end. But thank you so much for joining us. So myself and Lisa are really, really passionate about female health, and we just really believe that knowledge is such power when it comes to understanding what's going on in our body and makes us able to make really good choices. But there is still a really big knowledge gap when it comes to female health, so bridging that is part of our mission at Gigi and part of the reason why we have started doing these webinars as part of the Gigi Academy. So really hope you get something valuable and a level of understanding that you might not have had about your menstrual cycle and PMS and ovulation and why they matter and what your body's trying to tell you after this the next 30 minutes. It'll be a whistle-stop tour, but I think you'll still come away with lots of really good insights and practical tips as to how you can actually take control of whether it's tracking your cycle or pinpointing your fertile window, or just figuring out what the best strategies are in terms of maybe reducing your PMS or learning how to train and exercise in sync with your cycle rather than constantly feeling like you're fighting against it. So let's kick off with the fundamentals. So the different phase of the menstrual cycle. So what is actually happening over the course of our cycle? So day one is the first day of your period. So the first day of a proper bleed. So if you get some spotting in the run up to your period, we wouldn't count this. It's the first day of the proper bleed. And for most women, this lasts between 5 and 7 days. And I suppose that in itself, and whether your cycle is maybe your bleed is a little bit heavy or light, can tell us different things about the menstrual cycle as well. So it's constantly giving us these clues throughout. After we finish our bleed, we move into our follicular phase, and this phase is really dominated by rising levels of estrogen. So estrogen is one of our sex hormones, the female sex hormones that makes things grow. So it increases the lining of the uterus, it makes us feel more confident, it gives us energy, it really kind of builds us up. Around the midpoint of the menstrual cycle, we get ovulation. So it's not always around day 14, and the menstrual cycle length can vary from woman to woman. So a healthy menstrual cycle is considered anything from about 26 days right up until about 35 days. So as long as it's kind of regular for you, that is one of the kind of key indicators of, a healthy regular menstrual cycle. So at around the halfway point of the menstrual cycle, we get ovulation. So ovulation is the release of an egg from the ovaries, and it's through ovulation that we make our hormone progesterone. And that's really, really important, because if we just have lots of estrogen and not enough progesterone, we have a lot of imbalance in our hormones. So progesterone is that lovely calming hormone. It's anti-anxiety. It promotes good sleep. It really counterbalances all of the effects of estrogen. So neither are good, neither are bad. We need them in both optimal levels to function and for us to remain in a nice steady state of balance throughout the entire cycle. But as we move into those later days in the menstrual cycle and that late luteal phase, it's at that point that we can start getting symptoms of PMS and other kind of cycle symptoms. And that's really where we see that drop off in hormones around day 21 or 22. And that low kind of hormone phase and lead up for the period is when we can feel quite low, and women experience feelings of anxiety or just low mood in general. So I suppose knowing that a certain amount of these changes in how we're feeling are normal, but then also having an understanding, okay, well, what is actually normal? And just because it's common doesn't mean it's something that you just have to accept and put up with. So there are some more kind of insights that we'll discuss later on in the presentation slides. So ovulation is the main event of the menstrual cycle. So in school, or, speaking with our friends or family growing up even, the part of the menstrual cycle that was always and is always discussed is your period. Is your period regular? Is it, causing you trouble? Is it painful? And of course, that's a very good and important thing to talk about. But at the same time, very little time and attention is given to ovulation, except for when you're trying to get pregnant and have a baby. But ovulation is so important for such a range of different things in the female body, and it's not just for when you're trying to conceive. And that is primarily to do with the fact that it is how we make our progesterone. So if we're not ovulating, we're not getting progesterone, and that's when we start getting these symptoms that we don't want. So the really heavy bleeding where we have too much estrogen and we just aren't feeling ourselves at all. So we will always get a period about 14 days after ovulation if pregnancy doesn't occur. And that's because after ovulation occurs, the sac that the egg is in, and it becomes what's called the corpus luteum, and this secretes progesterone. And this sac of cells can only survive for a maximum of 14 days. So we know that after you've ovulated, if you're not pregnant, will get a period approximately 14 days later. This phase is your luteal phase, and this can be shorter. And that can be due to stress. It can be due to not fueling the body enough, or having undue kind of other stressors, such as too much exercise on the body, or just not enough nutrients. So we can chat a little bit more about that, but that is one of the reasons why ovulation is so important. And it's also the reason why we actually get a period, because if we didn't ovulate, we wouldn't have the lining of the uterus to shed, and we wouldn't have an egg, so we therefore wouldn't get a period. So it really is the main event of the menstrual cycle, and knowing when you ovulate and if you're ovulating every single month is a really powerful indicator of your overall health. The menstrual cycle is now considered the 5th vital sign for women. So that is next to blood pressure, respiratory rate. So it's really, really good indicator of your overall health. And despite what you may have heard from your home ec teacher in school or your biology teacher, there are actually only 6 days in your cycle that you can actually fall pregnant. And it's not every day. And I think that can actually come as a surprise to a lot of women when they then start actively trying to conceive and realize that it's actually harder than they thought it was, and you can't get pregnant every single day, despite what you've been told in an effort to scare you into using, some form of contraception. And we get this 6 days from you ovulate and you have an egg that will survive for 12 to 24 hours, and it waits in the uterus to be fertilized. And if it's not fertilized, it will die and be excreted. But the sperm can survive within the cervix for up to 5 days. So if we add that 5 days onto the 24 hours that your egg can survive, then we get that total of 6 days. And that 6 days is your fertile window. So aside from that 6 days, you aren't fertile at any other point within your cycle. So you're not fertile. You can't get pregnant when you have your period. You can't get pregnant in that luteal phase in the run up to your period. So knowing that is really powerful, because you can actually use that to actively conceive or actively not conceive if you're trying to not get pregnant. So that really gives us the fertile window, and it's something that a lot of women really try to start pinpointing when they're trying to get pregnant. But like I said, you can actually use it as a form of contraception if you so wish. So you might be familiar with apps and tools like Natural Cycles. So Natural Cycles is a form of contraception, and the way it works is by taking your basal body temperature every single morning, and it detects a rise post-ovulation. And the reason why that happens is because after you ovulate and your body has this level of progesterone it makes the body that little bit warmer. So once that higher level of basal body temperature is detected, we know that ovulation has occurred. I do think So tracking basal body temperature is the most accurate way to pinpoint ovulation. I do think it can be tricky to do without the assistance of an app or something like Natural Cycles that's really giving you that support to do it, and you can kind of see the graphs. You can chart it on a page, on a piece of paper, and there are lots of charts and templates online for the fertility awareness method. It's not the same as the calendar method that you may have heard of before in school. It is using scientific to give us this information. It's not calendar. You're not counting the days to arrive at a date or anything like that. But I will say that if you maybe are moving away from hormonal contraceptives and are looking for a way to see when you're fertile, either to get pregnant or not, tracking your basal body temperature and using something like Natural Cycles is fantastic. We're not associated with Natural Cycles at all, but both myself and Nisa use it personally and have done for years, and really, really like it. So if anyone has any questions on that, we're very, very happy to support you on that, because I know it can be quite daunting. I know when I was thinking of starting to use it 4 years ago, over 4 years ago, I didn't know anyone else using it. I was kind of saying, like, is this going to work? Like, is this, very accurate? I wasn't really sure. So I think knowing somebody else's experience is very helpful. So very happy to chat through that in some more detail if anyone would like. And then, of course, you can use things like ovulation test strips, and they work on the premise of detecting when your luteinizing hormones, or your LH, is surging. So they're often called LH strips, and your LH surges 36 hours or approximately 36 hours before you ovulate. So if you get a positive ovulation strip, it's likely that you'll ovulate within the next 36 hours. The one thing I will say here is that for any of my clients that, are actually trying to conceive and they're using test strips, I don't necessarily always recommend them, because I do think they can be quite stressful, because they can be a bit finicky and hard to interpret, and can cause a little bit of stress sometimes. So I think if you are using them, maybe just also use another indicator as well. So something like cervical mucus tracking or cervical fluid is another really good fertility biomarker that you could pair alongside using something like a test strip to give you that extra layer. And I will chat a little bit more in detail about cervical mucus and what to look out for in terms of fertility. But when we look at cycle tracking as a whole, what sort of things should you be looking out for? So there's different levels in terms of like tracking. So this particular picture here is actually a screenshot from Natural Cycles. So you can kind of see when the temperature inputs each morning, it shows you on the graph kind of where you're at and whether or not you've ovulated. And that would be quite a detailed level of tracking. But if that's not for you, you can simply track the length of your cycle. So day one when you get your period, and then track the next day one when you get your next cycle. And I think even that basic level of understanding, so whether your cycle is 24 days or whether your cycle is 30 days, that's giving you really good insight into your cycle. So then if any changes ever occur, you're kind of saying, okay, well, actually, this isn't normal for me. I've gone, the last 6 years and my cycle has always been 30 days. Like, why is it now suddenly 24 days? And you can start to like piece things together and say, okay, like, is my body under a little bit more stress, or, what's causing the shift? Was I sick? And it's really good data and insight into your menstrual cycle. And then aside from that, then you can add on things like tracking your cervical fluid. So a lot of these apps, and there are a lot of unpaid apps as well, so the likes of Flow and Clue, they're all really good ways to track your symptoms alongside the length of your cycle and the number of days that your period lasts. You can track how you're feeling, and then that gives you insight into like, okay, well, what are my trends? Are you finding, okay, well, at the end of in my mid-luteal phase, every month I'm feeling exhausted, or I'm getting these weird cramps, or I have really tender breasts. These are kind of things you can pick up about, and then you then are armed with, okay, well, these are my symptoms, and they're worse when I do this, or they're better when I do that. And it kind of gives you that overall picture of how you might be able to support yourself that little bit better. It also gives you an insight into what could be driving things like PMS. So your PMS could be driven by the fact that you're not ovulating. So if you're not ovulating you're not producing progesterone. And if you don't have enough progesterone, you are going to have really debilitating PMS symptoms. So again, it's giving you that granularity and that view into your menstrual cycle. So yeah, there are lots of different options in terms of different apps, and you can make it as complex or as simple as you want. Like I was saying, just tracking the length of your cycle at the very least. So when it comes to cervical fluid, this is actually a really strong indicator of fertility. So essentially why we get cervical fluid is the body's really clever. Around when you're ovulating, your body will produce really fertile cervical fluid, which is this egg white type cervical fluid. And this is an ideal medium for sperm to be carried to the egg in. So like our body is just so clever, and it wants to make all of the conditions really favorable for a successful pregnancy to actually occur. So in the lead up to when your body is going to ovulate, it starts to produce the cervical fluid. So it goes from being kind of non-existent around when you have like your period or the couple of days after your period, and then it starts to move through these different stages to more creamy consistency, to a more watery consistency, which has some level of, you know, support for sperm. But then when you get that really egg white like cervical fluid, that's when you know you're in your really most fertile days and that you're likely about to ovulate. My advice to any of my clients who are actively trying to conceive is to wipe before you actually go to the toilet, because it can be harder to decipher after you've gone. When we look at PMS, I mentioned there that, you know, if, say, for example, you're not ovulating, this can result in quite debilitating PMS. But ultimately what PMS is it's caused by a balance, the balance of estrogen and progesterone being thrown off for some reason. So you could have too much estrogen, or you could have, you know, too little progesterone relative to the amount of estrogen that you have. And this can then cause your hormones to be slightly off balance, and then resulting in different symptoms of PMS. So a lot of women really struggle with maybe low mood in that lead up to their period, or like I said, like maybe skin breakouts and menstrual migraines, and they're all different fluctuations from a hormonal perspective that really drive these symptoms. But there are things that you can do to support yourself. Lisa did a fantastic webinar in webinar number 1 of the Gigi Academy, all around female focused nutrition, and she discussed in detail the Mediterranean style diet that is really, really supportive for supporting your hormones and your overall health as well. But it also just really supports the menstrual cycle by reducing any inflammation, and PMS is really driven by inflammation as well. So when we're giving the body all of the nutrients that it needs, it's much less likely to have these kind of debilitating PMS symptoms. And of course, you're going to get some degree of, you know, being that little bit more tired. Like that run up and that lead up to your period is quite a taxing time for the body, so it's using up extra nutrients. That's where, you know, you also see cravings come in and a heightened appetite. That's all really normal. And I think when you're putting these dietary strategies like increasing your fiber and having that rich Mediterranean style diet that has lots of healthy fats and, you know, good quality lean protein in there, you're really going to help mitigate those symptoms. And then, of course, it is difficult to get the right amount of nutrients from our diet. Like our food just doesn't have the same quality of nutrients that it once had, and that's down to the soil being more depleted. And then we just live busier lives, and stress can deplete nutrients from the body, and medication can deplete nutrients from the body. I suppose that's also something worth noting, that if you're on the contraceptive pill, we've seen from scientific research that the contraceptive pill does deplete the body of key nutrients, and there are nutrients that are so important for menstrual cycle health, so the likes of magnesium, selenium, and your B vitamins. So if you are on the contraceptive pill, I would highly recommend that you're taking a good quality supplement to counterbalance these. And another key one is your folic acid. It has been shown to deplete the body of folate. So this is really important if you're then coming off the pill and actually then trying to conceive, because folic acid is obviously really important in that preconception and conception period for the baby. So it's really important to bring those levels of nutrients back up to a high standard in the body. And that is, I suppose, ultimately why myself and Lisa knew that we needed to create the PMS and hormone balance blend, because we didn't have a product on the market that had all of these nutrients in the right dose, in the right forms, to give women relief from PMS, but also just make their hormones more optimized and more balanced. So we have 15 really, really premium ingredients in here. We have your RDA of folic acid in the form of folate, which is much more bioavailable. We have your B vitamins for energy, zinc, which is so effective at supporting hormonal acne, and it promotes regular ovulation as well, which again we know is really important for getting that balance in your hormones. So these all work really symbiotically to just give you a much more balanced overall hormonal level within your menstrual cycle. And then when we look at PMS, it's not just, what we are eating and what supplements we're taking. Like, and you can't just look at that element of it. These lifestyle strategies sound so simple, but they are some of the most underrated things when it comes to supporting and relieving the body of PMS. So prioritize sleep. Sleep is one of the most underrated things for female hormonal health, like full stop. Whether you're going through the menopause or you're just you're about to get your period, it is one of the best things you can do for your hormones, and it's pretty inexpensive. I know there can be times in your life that it's harder to get that sleep, but for most people, if they really prioritize it, they can get that 7 to 8 hours, and that will do more for your hormones than just about any supplement. So that's first and foremost. The second is stress, and stress affects everyone differently. But when we say stress, it doesn't just mean like that psychological stress, like that stress from being overworked in your job, or fighting with your partner, or just having too much on your plate. Stress can also be not fueling your body correctly, maybe under eating, which is something I see a lot with women, or they've cut out a food group, particularly carbohydrates or fats, because they've always been demonized. But our female hormones need both carbohydrates and fat. So if you're not getting enough of those macronutrients, your body is going to see this as a perceived stress, and it will do something in terms of kicking out of balance your hormones. So just be really, really mindful of creating very balanced meals. And if you are trying to manage weight or lose weight, do it in a very sustainable way. Like, these kind of drastic diets that put you in a state of very low energy availability they wreak havoc on our female hormones, and you'll pay the price for it in the long term, in terms of trying to manage your hormonal health or use your cycle, which is something we see very, very often. And then movement is one of the most fantastic things for PMS. We've seen in scientific literature how effective it is at alleviating cramps and other sort of symptoms around this time, but it again needs to be tailored. So some people aren't doing enough. Their step count is really low and they haven't prioritized fitting exercise into their routine on a weekly basis, but then others are doing way too much. And I think this is a real point of, you really need to listen to your body. So if it's a case that you're in, your day 25 or 26 of your cycle and you're feeling really exhausted, like, maybe you don't need to go to that HIIT class. Maybe it's actually a much better idea to do some like low impact yoga or Pilates and like really calm down that nervous system. So just something to bear in mind, and not to underestimate the power of movement, both, whether you need to increase it if you're not doing enough, and then maybe tone it back if you're somebody who is doing a little bit too much. And we can absolutely exercise in sync with our cycle, and it's something that's become very trendy at the moment. Myself and Lisa actually wrote a blog for Gigi on this, if you are interested in this topic in a little bit more detail. But ultimately, because our follicular phase and our luteal phase, so like your follicular being before you ovulate and the luteal being after, we have a very different hormonal profile. So of course, we're going to feel different in both phases. So if we look at the follicular phase, we have that very estrogen dominant phase. So we have a heightened sensitivity to insulin in that first half of the cycle. So what that means is that our body is much more able to utilize carbohydrates as fuel. So that lends really favorably to high intensity workouts, to strength training, because we need that really easy accessible carbohydrate fuel source for those activities. We've also seen in some research that's indicating that hypertrophy training, so like that strength-based work, is really effective, and that women have a much more effective way of building muscle in that first half of our cycle. And that's partly to do with the fact that estrogen is a anabolic hormone, so it helps to build up those muscles. And then in the luteal phase, all types of exercise are good, and we do have a higher hormone phase, and that's thanks to the progesterone kicking in post-ovulation. But at this point in your cycle, it's really important to just figure out what it is that works for you. You might be feeling absolutely normal, and like you always do up until day 22 or 23. And maybe at that point, you kind of say, actually, I'm going to pare back my high intensity stuff and add some more kind of lower impact things that are kind of going to activate the parasympathetic nervous systems, that rest and digest, and to give your body that extra little bit of TLC at this time. But only you know what feels good for you. So I think that's really important. And we don't have an abundance of literature and research on this area. It's constantly emerging, and we know that there are differences throughout the phases, but at the same time, like no two women are the same and no two menstrual cycles are the same. So really do take time to figure out, okay, and check in, how am I feeling? And that's where your cycle tracking really does fit in and lend really favorably. But ultimately, our whistle stop tour, the key takeaways hopefully you've got from tonight is just an overall better understanding of your own menstrual cycle and the different phases and how you might be feeling and how you might kind of tailor your movement. And then ovulation. Why is it important? Even if you're not trying to have a baby, like, it's how we make our hormones. It's how we know that our body is, healthy and it's happy and it's not feeling too stressed. We have seen how we can pinpoint our fertile window, whether that's through your basal body temperature tracking with something like natural cycles, or you can even just use cervical fluid or LH trips, maybe if you are trying to conceive. Then supporting PMS, so really focusing on that Mediterranean style diet, your key supplements, and the lifestyle aspect of it as well, and really trying to manage your stress load where possible. And then the ability to tailor your exercise into the different stages of your cycle based on how you are feeling and what works for you. So I'm aware that that was a very quick 30 minutes, but I think it's just nice to be able to start the conversation and to give you a benchmark, and then you can go and kind of do any further research or figure out where it is that you might need an extra bit of support or an extra bit of understanding. But if there are any questions, of course, I'm very happy to answer them. But I am conscious that it might have just been a very quick whistle stop tour. Perfect. Well, I will just pause the recording.